Just this past week, a Saudi prince unexpectedly blasted Israel during a security conference in Bahrain, in a session ironically titled New Security Partnerships in the Middle East.
They profess that they want to be friends with Saudi Arabia. And yet, all Israeli governments are the last of the Western colonizing powers of the Middle East. From the time of the Balfour Declaration, they have forcibly evicted the inhabitants of Palestine after the 1948 war.
Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi spoke by video after the prince.
I would like to express my regret on the comments of the Saudi representative, the foreign minister. I don't believe that they reflect the spirit and the changes taking place in the Middle East.
The real question then is, does that say that the whole kingdom of Saudi Arabia has an attitude problem, or does it say that this guy has an attitude problem?
Former Israeli UN Ambassador Dori Gold also attended that conference, witnessing the prince's accusations.
I think he was being used by the highest authorities in Saudi Arabia to put some distance between us and them.
Gold tells CBN News the attitude toward Israelis appeared very warm, except for the prince. Gold believes Saudi Arabia could still come around, mainly because they have a common enemy.
I think it's the Iranian factor which gave birth to the Israeli-Arab peace process as we know it today.
Danny Danone, another former UN ambassador, tells CBN News he believes the Saudis will eventually join the Abraham Accords.
They are the most important one for the region, for Israel, and they understand that once they will normalize the relations with Israel, we will see much more stability in the region, and it will be a major force to block the hostility coming from Iran.
Gold points to Washington as being the major part of this puzzle. And what happens next?
If they hear from Washington, we like the Abraham Accords, we want more treaties between Israel and its neighbors, great.
Gold says while the Trump administration has improved the connection between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which led to opening its airspace to Israeli planes, it could all change if a Biden administration were to take a different approach.
If, on the other hand, they don't acknowledge that, they say, no, you want to improve the Middle East environment, give the Palestinians more money and make the Palestinians the center of everything, that will not move us very far along.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thanks, Chris. Gordon, how much does the prince's comments pour cold water on the warming relations with Israel?
Well, I hope it doesn't pour any cold water because factually it's just wrong. What he said is not the historical record. Here's the historical record. The League of Nations got together because they won World War I. In winning World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and so countries were created. Iraq was created. Saudi Arabia was created. Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinians were put into a special British mandate. In that mandate, the League of Nations at the San Remo conference said we need to establish a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state in the former lands owned by the Ottoman Empire. And that was the whole purpose of the British mandate. The Palestinians, it's a mistake to call them that because they didn't even call themselves that way back in the 1920s. They were Arabs. They were ethnic Arabs who had been brought in by the Ottomans to work their land, and they didn't own the land. The Ottomans did. So they steadfastly resisted a Jewish state and did so for pure reasons of anti-Semitism. To say that they were forcibly evicted is, again, a historical lie. When the Israeli state was announced in 1948, the Arab nations surrounding Israel all declared war against her, and they said to the Arab inhabitants, please evacuate because we don't want you to be a casualty in the war. When we win the war, you can move back. So to say it's a forcible eviction is, again, it's not part of the historical record at all. I'm really getting tired of the revisionist history. We also see the same revisionist history in President Obama's memoirs, where he's talking about a British occupation. It wasn't a British occupation at all. This was all established by international law. It was all established by the League of Nations and the UN specifically when it was formed after another World War, World War II. It adopted all of the policies of the League of Nations. So this is established international law. Israel has a right to exist, and it's high time for all the neighboring states to recognize that right. Now, we've got something that's happened under the current administration, under the Trump administration. It's a radical move. We're no longer going to focus solely on the Palestinian problem. We're going to go around it, and we're going to establish peace with each individual state and create a new bloc and a new alliance within the Middle East. It's an absolute brilliant stroke. Under Secretary of State John Kerry, he said, no, you can't do that. You can't have individual peace. You have to first solve the Palestinian problem. Well, when you look at the world that way, you end up with an insolvable problem because the Palestinians never want to solve the problem. They don't want a two-state solution. They do not want peace. And this has been the reality for 100 years now. Let's wake up to the reality. They want to drive Israel into the sea. They teach their children that. They reward people who kill Jews. They reward them based on the severity of the sentence that they receive in Israel for acts of terror. When you look at it from this point of view, our foreign policy on this has been absolutely nuts and has been that way for decades. It's so refreshing to find someone that says, no, this isn't the way anymore. And by all means, the American taxpayer isn't going to pay for this. And so we're going to stop paying the Palestinian Authority and we're going to stop paying UNRWA. Well, elections have consequences. And here's some consequences that we should be looking at. Number one, Biden has already said he's going to reinstitute payments to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA. I find that absolutely unbelievable. Legally, he's going to have a problem because of the Taylor Force Act and because of another terrorism act that was passed in 2018. So he's going to face legal challenges to this because if any of the money goes to those terrorists, he's got a big problem. Here's the second problem. He's been encouraged to reactivate the Iranian treaty on its current level with no renegotiation. I find this absolutely incredible that we would try to bring this back up after it's so plain that they're trying to develop a nuclear weapon, and they were using that treaty as a cover for it. This is incredible. For Iran to get a nuclear weapon is unbelievable, completely destabilizing to the region. And that's one of the keys to the Abraham Accords. It's trying to create an alliance against Iran and Iran's aggression, which has been evident. They launched drone attacks against the refineries in Saudi Arabia. They've used proxies against our own troops in Iraq. They have been funding Hamas and other terror groups for decades. They are the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world today. Now, here's something that just happened. Representative Gregory Meeks, he's the incoming chair of the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee. This man has real power. He wrote a letter to Biden saying, please reinstitute the Iranian treaty without any renegotiation. I find it incredible that a congressman with that kind of authority and that kind of information would write that letter. But that's what we're facing. That's what we're looking at. I hope the Biden administration, I hope the incoming Secretary of State, I hope they all wake up to this and say nuclear Iran is a non-starter for us. Let's go forward with the Abraham Accords. Let's not make the Palestinian Authority the deciding issue in the Middle East. Let's create coalitions to come against what is quite clearly an aggressive power using terrorism, using drones. If they get nuclear weapons, the game